So today we're going to talk about digital audio. Why and what is it? How many of you out there have heard people sort of go, it was so much better when we had analog. Analog sounds great. Analog is the way it's supposed to be. Analog is how we hear music. Analog, analog, analog. But why are we digital now? Why did we feel the need to take these wonderful analog waveforms that we've been able to capture onto vinyl disc and to magnetic tape and chop them all up and then try to reassemble them using digital numbers? Why would we want to do that? And that's a valid question. Because really, when you get down to it, analog tape sounds fantastic for recording. It's got a lot going on. There's a natural saturation and EQ that happens with the tape that's just great. And so yeah, we've made some pretty marvelous sounding music without even touching the digital realm at all. Well, what are the limitations that we were trying to overcome here? When we sit and think about it for a minute, we realize there are a lot of limitations to analog. So how can we possibly improve those, and what kind of technology can we bring forth that would bring those improvements? Thoughts about digital started coming around in the mid into early 80s, and actually probably earlier than that, really. There's a lot of things we could do better, as it turns out, than just basic analog. For one thing, it would be nice to have a better frequency response, for instance, because though tape and vinyl theoretically give us our 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz hearing range of human hearing, we're still getting a lot of high-end roll-off. We get a lot of low-end rumble on vinyl discs. Reproduction of the sound completely depends on who's playing the record. I mean, what kind of stereo is somebody listening to it on? It's going to sound different no matter how you reproduce it. Frequency response is a thing that, yeah, we can improve that. Sure, we can do that. We can improve the dynamic range too, because at best, tape and vinyl give us about 60 to 70 dBs of dynamic range, which it's been enough. I don't think anybody was complaining about, hey, we need more dynamic range, except the classical folks. Let's face it, with classical music, when things get really, 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 really quiet and then really, 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 really loud, that's sort of what's kind of great about classical music, is that you have these extremes of dynamics. Magnetic tape and vinyl disc was not capturing that adequately to the very, very softest pianissimo to the fortissimos. Folks in the classical world were saying, we would really, really appreciate it if we could have a recording situation that allows us to get all the dynamics of great classical music. We could do better than 60 or 70 dBs, in other words. We have this idea that we need to store this stuff. Now we have magnetic tape is our main storage up until this point of our audio signals. And magnetic tape is actually pretty robust when you get down to it. In fact, we're finding it to be more robust all the time compared to a lot of the early digital formats. But be that as it may, things can happen to tape. Tape can be melted, tape can be dropped, tape can be dropped into a vat of acid, tape can be unspooled and worn like a boa. Has to be in a climate-controlled environment, can't get too hot, can't get too cold, can't get too dry or moist. After 60 years, probably needs to be baked in order to get the sound back off of it again. Wouldn't it be great if we had a more robust storage medium so we could store it in, let's say, well, zeros and ones? And if you can store all this information in something that's that binary, we can probably have a very robust storage method for that. Magnetic tape can get erased and stuff. I mean, you can bring a big magnet over by a magnetic tape and you can lose all kinds of stuff. Then there's also this need to have a better way of replicating. The big problem with analog is that anytime we make a copy of analog, we're losing frequencies. Every generation, it degenerates the sound. So wouldn't it be great if we had some sort of a storage medium that if we made copies of it, didn't degenerate? So yes, there were improvements that we could make over analog as we knew it. So we started reaching for the possibilities of the digital world. When we talk about the digital world, of course, we're talking about information theory, and we're talking about Claude Shannon, who is probably the father of information theory. Any value that you care to want me to express, I can express using a combination of ones and zeros. This whole idea of the binary of ones and zeros, being able to do this, made a lot of sense to the folks in the phone business, because all phone information was trafficked using binary switches, ones and zeros. Maybe we can use this now to create a way of expressing values that we can then possibly used to sample waveforms and recreate them. His theory was that, yes, you can sample a waveform and you can precisely reproduce that waveform digitally. But the catch was that you had to sample it at a rate at least double the bandwidth of the signal. You had to at least have at least 2 samples to express the highest frequency that was being generated by your source sound. The other caveat to this was that in order to do this also, you have to limit the bandwidth to make sure that's filtered out at half of the sampling rate to make sure that this happens. The period of waveform requires no less than 2 samples to reproduce it accurately, which is good news. So 2 samples per waveform, as long as we can observe that, then we can do digital sampling. But what is sampling? You probably have some idea of what this already is, but sampling, of course, is we take our acoustically generated waveform. We want to try to convert that into a series of binary numbers. So we take pictures of the waveform and we capture those voltages and we have a certain sample rate. We are able to then sort of get some idea of what the waveform's amplitude is at unique points in time. If we can somehow take samples or snapshots of the sound at very, very regular intervals and have values for each of those snapshots, we should be able to theoretically recreate that original analog waveform from those snapshots. Because we can store those snapshots as binary numbers and encode it into pulse code modulation as a result. Pulse code modulation is a square wave cycle, and the duty cycle denotes the 1s and 0s. And so we can actually very easily transmit these numbers in pulse code modulation form, and it's a robust form because it's either 1 or 0. There's no in-between points. It's really easy to sort of maintain exactly what you put into it once you get these numbers. And it's pretty resistant to unwanted signals and distortion. And it can travel through a cable. It can be manipulated, it can be stored in these formats. We are trying to actually capture a waveform that has infinite points on it. It doesn't go sample, 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 sample. There are infinite points in between those samples. How are we going to get all those to be sort of captured by this process? Just like we would with a dimmer switch on our light. Any point along that line, you can stop and have infinite different levels of light possible by just manipulating that dimmer. But then with the digital world, we don't have a dimmer switch, we have switches. So in this case, for instance, in this picture I'm showing you here, I've got a 2-bit system here, which means I have 4 possible settings. Both of them off, one on, one off, the other on, the other off, and both on. That's it. In order to really sort of replicate that dimmer switch over there, I need more switches and I need the ability to switch them fast. The faster I switch these switches and the more switches that I have, the closer I can get to replicating what that dimmer switch can do with just about anything in the middle. Let's talk first about the how many switches part of it. And this refers to how many bits that we're talking about, or what we would call the word length. So you probably heard about 16 bits, 8 bits, 16 bits, 24 bits, 32 bits. Any sample that we're going to be trying to create in our environment here is going to have a fixed amount of bits. How many bits we have is going to tell us our dynamic range of the recording. How many bits per sample we have means a higher resolution and we have more possible states. For instance, an 8-bit word length, 256 states, I can get a 48 dB dynamic range with an 8-bit word length. Is that any good? Hell no, it's no good. We need to do better than 48 dB dynamic range, certainly, for our music. 16 bits gets us up to 65,536 possible states for our samples. That gets us to 96 dBs of dynamic range. 24-bit word length gets us up to 144 dB dynamic range. And that's why we like 24-bit word lengths. We can really get a lot of dynamic range from that. As you probably know, 16 bits was our industry standard for CD production and always has been and still is. And if we want to have 24-bit or 32-bit files to listen to, we can do that, but we have to get that pretty much from our DAWs. 16-bit is still industry standard. 24 is pretty much taken over at some point. I think we can safely say that 24 is here. 24 bits to express each of our discrete samples in time. Then we have to talk about how fast we can do the switching. So I've got 24 switches, and I got my hands out. Now if I can switch them super fast, I can get a lot closer to replicating what I can do with that dimmer switch. But how fast can I switch? We call that the sample rate. And most of you have probably heard of 44.1 kilohertz, which is, again, for CDs, 16-bit, 44.1 kilohertz, that's the standard. Nowadays, our sample rate, we are doing a lot more 48 and 96 and higher sample rates than that. The sample rate is the number of samples per second. So obviously, the faster the sample rate and the bigger the word length, the better resolution we're going to get for our sound. We're taking snapshots at a certain sample rate in time, and we're capturing those discrete moments. But there's another way to look at this that we kind of need to look at, which is the simple fact that the sample rate itself is a frequency, and it's when we are actually using it to sample things, we are actually doing FM modulation. If we're going at 48,000 kilohertz, that's a frequency. The stuff that we're recording is like a modulator to that carrier wave, just like in FM broadcasting. What we're dealing with is this pulse amplitude modulation. In other words, just like we were doing FM, like frequency modulation, we're doing pulse amplitude modulation, and as a result of this, we're going to end up with harmonics of the sampling rate. At 48K, I'm going to have a harmonic at 96K. I'm going to have harmonics at multiples of that. And I'm going to also have information up around those harmonics that I'm recording here. Fortunately, I can't hear those because they're out of my hearing range, but they do exist. This is not usually a problem, but it can be. And we have to sort of be mindful of this because there's this little thing called aliasing that we have to be watching out for. Aliasing occurs in the process of reconstructing our waveform when there's just too few samples per cycle. A gentleman by the name of Harry Nyquist, some of you may have heard of, in cahoots with Claude Shannon, and he says that the sample rate must be at least double the highest frequency to avoid any ambiguity when you reconstruct the signal. In other words, the Nyquist frequency is the frequency that is half of the sample rate. Human hearing goes from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So the highest thing we can even hear or even want to bother recording is going to be 20 kilohertz. If we record anything over than that, we can't hear it anyways. There's no point. Let's not do it. 20 kilohertz is, for all intents and purposes, our mental Nyquist number. Our sample rate needs to be at least 40 kilohertz. 44.1 kilohertz is chosen in order to make this happen. You have to filter out, and there must be nothing going past the Nyquist frequency. So in other words, for us, nothing can pass 22.05 kilohertz for a 44.1 kilohertz scenario. So that gives us from 20 kilohertz to 22.05 kilohertz to filter out, which, by the way, that's not easy to do. This idea of a brick wall filter that you just sort of, at some point, you can just cut off everything. Filters don't work that way. Filters need a little space to do their job. The idea of a brick wall filter ain't going to happen. Bottom line, though, is if we can make sure that there's no frequencies going past the Nyquist frequency, we are ensured that we will be able to recreate our original analog signal after we've converted it to digital. So here is an example. For instance, I've got a sample rate of 40 kilohertz. Now, nobody samples at 40 kilohertz, but this is just for an example. I got a 40 kilohertz sampling rate. I do a sine wave tone at 5 kilohertz, and I sample that. But you notice over here, at our sample rate, we have harmonics that happen, and it'll happen at the sample rate primarily. It'll also happen at the harmonic of the sample rate. So what happens is, with our 5 kilohertz tone, we get also a 35 kilohertz tone and a 45 kilohertz tone on both sides of the sampling rate. So in other words, 5 kilohertz on either side of the sampling rate. Those frequencies are going to pop up because of our sampling rate. 20 kilohertz is our upper range. We're not going to hear 35 kilohertz. We're not going to hear 45 kilohertz. All good. Not going to hear it. 5 kilohertz tone is well underneath our Nyquist number, which in this case would be 20 kilohertz. So everything's cool. The sidebars are not going to affect what we're going to hear. We will hear our 5 kilohertz tone, and everything's reconstructed properly. Here's another scenario where things could go wrong. In this case, I've got a sample rate of 48 kilohertz. I don't know why I changed the sample rate on you. I just did it. And this time I've got a square wave with a fundamental of 10 kilohertz. One thing I have to remember about a square wave is that square waves have odd harmonics going up. 3 times the frequency, 5 times the frequency, 7 times the frequency. We're going to have harmonics because we're not filtering this thing. So we have a square wave, fundamental of 10 kilohertz. Our sampling rate is 48. We're generating 10 kilohertz sidebands of 38 and 58 kilohertz around the sample rate frequency. Okay, we're not going to hear those, so we're good. My 10 kilohertz tone, unfortunately, has this third harmonic that's going to come up because it's a square wave. And that third harmonic is going to be 30 kilohertz. And 30 kilohertz is past my 24 Nyquist number. Now, we were not going to hear 30 kilohertz, but if it didn't get filtered out, it's going to show up as a sideband over at my sampling rate, and I'm going to end up with sidebands on either side. I'm going to have one at 78 kilohertz, way out of range, not going to hear that, but then the sideband on the bottom end is going to drop down to 18 kilohertz. And guess what? We can hear that. And that aliasing is going to sound like a correlated sound. That's part of the sound that you can't get rid of. It's ugly, it's nasty, it's bad. So this is an example of how you can inadvertently and quite accidentally break the Nyquist law and end up with an aliasing situation. You're not going to be adding a lot of stuff up there above the Nyquist frequency anyway. Most people don't add 20K and up to their mixes because, number one, we can't really hear it. Number two, it doesn't really do us any good. If we can hear it, it just sort of sounds like some really super high-end frosting on it. It's not really going to help us much. Don't add too much high-end information and trust your analog to digital converter because it will have a built-in filter that will take care of this. So let's talk a little bit about the storage and transmission of our digital signal. We can turn these ones and zeros into a stream of ones and zeros and turn that into what we call PCM, pulse code modulation, and that can be transmitted through copper or fiber optical cable. When digital first came out, the problem was how to record it. We've created this digital format, we've created a digital transmission way to do it, and we've even kind of created a way to print it onto a CD. But how do we get it from our master recording to the CD? The original idea was to use tape recorders, of course, to use analog tape. There was too much information to get onto the analog tape head. They couldn't get a head that could do it or get the tape that could do it. But what they did realize is that they could take video cassette players with the helical heads, and since they were reading a lot more information a lot faster for video, they could take that to store digital information. So the original one was the Sony PCM 1600 video cassette recorder, and that allowed it to get 3 samples per line onto VHS tape, or I guess beta. We have this difference of power between US and Japan and Europe. But Europe and Japan have a 50 hertz power cycle, and the video cassette machines depend on that power cycle to refresh the page. In the United States, it's 60 hertz. They had to figure out, well, we need to figure out some sort of a universal thing we can do so that it will accommodate both the US and Europe and Japan. They figured out we're going to use 44.1 kilohertz as our universal sample rate because in the US with NTSC, we had 60 fields per second with our refresh rate with a 60 hertz cycle, 3 samples per line, 245 lines per field. With the PAL, 294 lines per field at 50 fields per second, 44,100 kilohertz became the decided upon sample rate that would accommodate all over the world. And that's why it's 44.1, not 40, not 48, but 44.1. Let's say that we've somehow metaphorically figured out how to make a D-to-A converter and we've recorded our stuff and we played it back and we're listening and we listened back and it sounds not good at all. It sounds actually pretty awful. There's this weird noise happening. This is supposed to work. Nyquist and Shannon told us we could make this happen. Why are we getting screwy stuff on our conversion coming back? Keep in mind, we're trying to capture a waveform with infinite points on its waveform using discrete samples. So there's always values between those samples that are not being recognized. Between this sample and that sample, it's not staying at that rate and then going to the sample. There's stuff happening between those samples. Because when we sort of decide that we're going to commit to one or the other, then we end up adding this little extra bit of noise. this thing we call quantization noise. In the process of quantization, the values that are not being represented by the samples, in between the samples, these being sort of stair-stepped up, manifest themselves as a very, very strange sounding noise. Correlated to the sound, you can't really get rid of it. You can't filter it out. It's just bad. You can't use it. The first time they tried to reproduce digital stuff, and they did everything right, like they thought they were going to do it, and this happened. I'm sure there was a lot of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth about this. In the process of quantizing it, what if we add just a little bit of noise at the level of the least significant bit, and just to sort of add a slight randomization, we just add that noise to the signal and have that get quantized, and then we would average that out over time, and as a result, maybe we would get a little bit more linear reading of the waveform. In other words, sort of shaking the hand as we do this. It kind of worked. The quantization noise left, and all we were left with was just a little bit of low-level noise, some of that noise that we added originally, and with just a little tiny bit more on top of that. Very, very low level. This is what we call dither. You probably never recorded anything thinking, hey, I've got to add dither to that. Dither is a very important aspect to digital recording in the process of quantizing from analog to digital. And what this does, again, is it gets rid of the quantization noise from the reconstituted waveform, adds a very, very quiet noise floor, and that also allows us to hear a lot of the lowest level sounds possible that we're going to get lost by that least significant bit. It actually brings those into the picture, and we can hear stuff that's actually below the noise floor. It's kind of great. So you've got to have dither. Anytime you're doing any kind of A to D conversion to do the quantization, there has to be dither in the process. For the most part, dither is built into most of these A to D converters. You don't actually have to buy a dither box or do a dither plugin per se. The other thing that we have to use dither for is if anytime we're going from, let's say, from 24 to 16 bits, if we're going from many bits to less bits, we have to use a little bit of dither to do a little randomization to the quantization, and that will also help us get a better reading of our original signal. It's kind of funny that we actually have to add noise to our pristine digital signal in order to get it to sound pristine. How about that for ironic? I think I've adequately explained the basics of what we're doing with digital. How does it work? How do we create the digital stream that we do? I didn't really get too much into bringing it back from digital to analog. The reading that I've assigned to you also talks about this a bit more. We're always adding more bits. We have 32 and 64-bit systems. When we're using our plugins, for instance, we usually jump up to 64 bits for all that action, and then that's then dithered down to whatever we're recording in, if it's 24 or 32. This hopefully gets you a fundamental understanding of what that is. All right, thanks for your time. Talk to you soon. Hold the phone before we go any further. We need to do a quick review about binary to decimal, because we're doing sampling. We have sample rates, we have word lengths. We are taking these snapshots, these samples of our acoustic waveform. In order to recreate the waveform, we are finding out different values, but these are values that are positive, they're negative. Sometimes these values have floating points, like 32.92 or 570,972.579. I mean, sometimes these are the values that we are finding out when we are measuring our waveform. But how does these translate into the real world, and how do we go back and forth between the binary world and the decimal world? And by the way, I am in sequester mode here in New York, and yes, in fact, that is George Washington over my head. But enough about me. Anyways, let's talk about binary and decimal. What are we talking about in the first place? What do those ones and zeros really mean? Let's figure it out. We organize a lot of times our ones and zeros, our bits, if you will, the ones and zeros, into bytes. And a byte is 8 bits. And sometimes we organize those bytes into what they call nibbles, which are 4 bits. So 4 bits are a nibble, 8 bits are a byte. We've always dealt with base 10, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10 numbers, so there's a 10 base to our decimal system. But when we're dealing with computers and we're dealing with these absolutes of 0 and 1, the switches, if you will, that we have inherited from the Bell Labs, now we have to sort of figure out how we're going to express our decimal numbers into a binary form. So the best way we can do this is take, for instance, an 8-bit grouping, which again we call a byte, And in this case, we're going to assign a different value to each position of this byte. The first position in column 1, or what we might call the least significant bit, would be 2 to the 0, which would always be 1. And then going to 2 to the first power, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, going from right to left. Let's look at the most basic element of the binary number. 0 is 0. 1 is 1. So now we want to say 2. Well, we're out of possibilities with just that one bit, so now we have to add a bit. So that becomes our 2-bit, our 2 to the power of 1. So 1, 0 is now 2. And now we can say 3 is 1, 1. So now we've exhausted our possibilities again. We have to add another column. So we add another column, a 1 over there. That becomes our 2 to the 2, or our 4-bit position. 4 becomes 1, 0, 0. And then we can have 5 as 1, 0, 1, 6 as 1, 1, 0, 7 as 1, 1, 1. And once again, we've exhausted our possibilities. We have to add another 1. So for 8, it's 1, 0, 0, 0. And this keeps going on. We fill in all of those until we get to 15 here at the bottom, which is 1, 1, 1, 1. Again, exhausted our possibilities with our 4 bits. Now we have to add another bit place, and that will be the 16-bit. So this goes on and on and on. And that sort of takes us back to this table here. Each of these positions now denotes these numbers. An 8-bit number or byte, the largest number that can actually give us is 256, because we have all ones will add up to 256. And then we would have to add, again, another column. So that's how we start making numbers. Just to reiterate, the largest value that we can say with 8 bits is 256. Anywhere from 0 to 256 we can say with those 8 columns. All right, so that's a little bit about our bytes here. If we had an 8-bit system, that'd be the maximum of our different states that we could talk about. But we deal with 16 bits. We deal with 24 bits. We deal with 32 floating point bits. So that gives us a lot more numbers, lots more different possibilities. How can we do a quick and easy binary to decimal conversion? Let's line up our little 8-column bit situation. We got column 1, or 1 column, 2, column 2, column 3, and we're going from right to left here again. I'm not going from left to right. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. This is a good sequence of numbers to memorize, because anytime I've ever got to do binary to decimal conversion, I just simply write out this sequence of numbers, and this makes it so much easier. Okay, so here's an example. We have 1101, 1010. Okay, make that into a decimal number. So what we'll do is we'll write out this number sequence just like I did. 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, and 1. We'll line up those bits underneath those numbers from left to right, as we did here in example 1. And then we're just simply going to add up the weight numbers here that are over the ones. In this case, for example 1, we're going to add up 128, 64, there's a 0 for 32, don't add that, 16, 8, we won't add 4, 2, and we won't add the 1. We add those numbers up and we get 218. That's how we can find out that 11011010 is decimal 218. Here's our example 10011101. Line them up underneath our little number sequence here. 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. Then we just add up the numbers over the ones. This time we add up 128, 16, 8, 4, and 1. We get 157. Here's a little trick for you. If your binary number ends with a 1, it's always an odd number. Just so you know. That's a good way to check it. So that's binary to decimal conversion. Not so hard to do. Now how do we do decimal back to binary? Again, what we do, we draw our little 8 box matrix here. 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1. Let's say we have the number 22 here, as in this example. We have to look for the largest power of 2 here in our sequence of 128, 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1, which is smaller than this number. 128 is not smaller than it. Let's go ahead and put a 0 there. 64 is not smaller than 22. 0 there. 32 is not smaller than 22. 0 there. But 16 is smaller than 22. So we put a 1 there. And we subtract the 16 from the 22, giving us 6. Okay, we take 6. Is 8 smaller than 6? No, we put a 0 there. Is 4 smaller than 6? Yes, it is. So we put a 1 there. And then we subtract that 4 from the 6, we get 2. Then we go down to the next one. Is 2 smaller than or equal to 2? It is equal to 2, so we put a 1 there. That leaves us 0. That leaves us 0 in the 1 position. 10110 is how we would say 22, or 00010 equals 22. You can say it either way. You can leave off the zeros in the front if you want. So that's how we go back and forth between decimal and binary. The best way, again, to do it is to line them up in this row using these numbers. If you're talking about more than 8, you can see over here down these powers of 2. We would go the next column over would be 512, the next column over would be 1024, the next column over would be 2048, the next one over would be 4096. So if we had 12 bits to look at, we're talking about some bigger numbers. But a lot of times we generally like to do this in groups of 8 in what we call bytes. And that's why you hear a lot about bytes in terms of how things are stored and how numbers are presented. How do we say a negative number? Because we can't really put a little plus or minus sign in front of our digital number. So how are we going to talk about a negative or positive number? We have this thing called 2's complement. For instance, if we want to say -5, and again, this has to be a situation where the system is designed to accept 2's complement as its function. Not all digital systems accept a negative value. And the way we do this is we'll take the most significant bit, which is the bit furthest on the left. We'll make that 1 for negative. And then what we do is we then turn all of the zeros to 1s and the 1s to 0s, as we see here in this example. And then at the very end, we add a 1 to the end. So 5 is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1. When we do the 2's complement, we turn the first 0 to 1, and then we turn all the other zeros to 1s and 1s to 0s. Then that last 0 becomes a 1. Our -5 is now 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. With example number 2, with -13, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1. We know that's a negative number because we are given that a 2's complement. Then we're going to want to turn that to a positive number. We flip that first bit back over to a 0 to say it's positive. We flip all the 1s to 0s, the 0s to 1s, and then at the end we add a 1. And that tells us 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, which is +13, and that adds up. That's how we can express a negative value. Sometimes we have to do that with audio because audio goes up and down, above and below the 0 mark. Some of you may have heard the term hexadecimal. It's just another way of expressing a byte. We'll take our number or a byte. It can even be more than a byte. We can have as many as we need to, but they're usually in groups of 4s. And we'll group them in 4s and then take each of those 4s and assign a number to it. We have these 4-bit groups. The one furthest on the right, 0, 1, 0, 1, that is obviously a 5. 0, 0, 1, 1, that's obviously a 3. But then we have 1, 0, 1, 1, and we're calling that B. Why are we calling that B? Well, because the number that it is 11. And what we're trying to do is each of these nibbles is express it as a single digit. So over here on the right, you can see how they work out with their hexadecimal system. Once we get past 9, then we're going to be calling 10A, 11B, 12C, 13D, 14E, and 15F. And that covers all of our 16 possibilities with our 4-bit binary digit. That's because we have 16 possible states in a 4-bit nibble. And why would we want to use hexadecimals? We use them in MIDI sometimes, but we also use them in this ASCII table. We can also use hexadecimals to express letters and characters that can then be used as metadata. Now we're able to add all kinds of extra information to just our bit stream, and still we're doing just 1s and 0s, but they can then represent all of these letters and different functions and characters. But it's kind of interesting to note how we are able to express so many things just doing 0s and 1s and grouping them in certain ways. One more little thing, some of you have probably heard a little bit about floating point, because we can also express numbers that have decimals. To be able to do this with just 0s and 1s, that's pretty cool. So let's look into this.
the world is not just integers. We have to have floating point numbers. We have to be able to express things like 3.14159, like pi, for instance. Any of these numbers like the seconds in a nanosecond. A lot of these numbers have to be able to be expressed in zeros and ones. How can we possibly do that? We are able to do this with 32-bit floating point. We divide up our big old 32-bit word, if you will, or word length. The first bit, the most significant bit for this one on the left, we call the sign bit in this case. So we're not doing 2's complement. Now we're just basically saying, hey, that's a minus or a plus. And then the next group of bits are the exponent. And that sort of tells us 2 to the certain power that this number is going to be multiplied by to express it. So this can give us now any kind of large number, or it could be a negative number. So it would be a very, very small number. This sort of sets the field of huge numbers, small numbers, great range of values. And this is sort of where our decimal point sort of is set. And then the fraction field is the number that we're really trying to express in this manner. The value of the floating point number is the s, which is our sign bit, 1 or -1. The value that's expressed by the fraction field, then to the exponent that is expressed by the e field. So the floating point is where we can do very, very complicated plus or minus numbers with decimal points. We get all of our digital numbers that we could possibly want in all kinds of different systems simply from zeros and ones, just like Claude Shannon and Harry Nyquist made it possible for us to do many years ago. When we are doing sampling, these are the numbers that we are creating and able to use to measure the different points on the waveforms that we are then going to try to recreate into an analog waveform and make marvelous sound and music happen. Hopefully this gives you some idea of what these numbers mean, binary to decimal, what the zeros and ones signify. And that's digital audio. And I and George bid you a fond farewell. Talk to you soon.